Welcome to History 102, Lecture 15, The Second Great Awakening. In this part, we're going to talk about we're going to define the Second Great Awakening, talk about the definition of Second Great Awakening, and significant aspects, theological aspects of the Second Great Awakening. First, let's define the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is generally defined by historians as a religious movement in the United States from roughly 1800 to 1840, the height being in the decades of the 1820s and 30s. The Second Great Awakening is characterized mostly by a rural frontier movement. The goal of Second Great Awakening ministers is to bring the church to the frontier. The historical idea being that as Americans flooded west in the early 19th century, they took everything with them but church. And so for Second Great Awakening ministers, the goal is to go out on the frontier, go west onto the frontier, places like Ohio, western New York, and Kentucky, and Tennessee, and Missouri, and Illinois, and Indiana, the West, and bring church to them, because the thought was that a lot of Americans left church back home. It's characterized by several things that are important to American history and our ideas of religious freedom and even reform impulses. The Second Great Awakening is characterized by this democratic impulse of how do you express your freedom through religious innovation, through worshiping in different ways, to even having non-traditional religious beliefs for the time period. Utopianism is going to develop out of the Second Great Awakening as Americans in the early 19th century, as American culture developed in the early 19th century. Some Americans looked at what culture had developed and said, if this is bad, this is wrong, or whatever, it needs to be reformed. And so utopianism develops in the early 19th century as a response to that culture that is developed, that we talked about in Lecture 12, Expressions of American Nationalism. Early 19th century Americans created this definition of what an American is, and now as that culture is developed, some Americans go, well, it needs to be different in some ways. So the Second Great Awakening is part of that 19th century reform movement as Americans started looking at changes to make in American society, changes in that definition that we've come up with. So you see that through reform, through the democratic impulse of new religious ideas, through utopianism and revivalism. A lot of Second Great Awakening theology, when you get into the theology, a lot of Second Great Awakening theology rejects the Calvinist theology that predominated in colonial America. And so you see in the early 19th century, that's kind of the thing, you see a break. You see a break with colonial America. It's like we're not like those people back then. We're different. We're American. We're not British colonists. We're not colonies. We're an American. Well, what is an American then? How is it different from Britain? How is it different from England? How is it different from being British? How is it different from being a colonial American? So a lot of Second Great Awakening theology rejects the Calvinism of colonial America. The biggest theological idea that is rejected is the idea of free will. And if you remember from previous lectures, in Calvinism, there is no free will. For John Calvin and his theology, everything's up to God. God makes all the decisions. There's no human free will. You're wicked. You're sinful. You're a creation of God. You have no will of your own, other than whether you're influenced by God or Satan. And so in Calvinism, you have kind of the one end of the spectrum where you reject free will. In the Second Great Awakening, a lot of Second Great Awakening ministers adopted this idea that Of course you have free will as a human soul. And it ties into this American idea of freedom of religion, right? Americans are free, right? Americans are free to speak, to have a free press, to have freedom of religion, freedom of this, freedom of that. And so for a lot of Second Great Awakening ministers, you extend that to the spiritual sphere. Of course you have free will to choose your eternal destiny, whether it be heaven or hell. And so this idea, this concept of free will is the most obvious and most significant change in 19th century theology from colonial America. And some Second Great Awakening ministers go so far as saying there's 100% free will. You completely choose whether you go to heaven or go to hell. It's a human choice. The human soul decides where they end up. Again, going back to this reform idea in the early 19th century America, the Second Great Awakening, this religious revival that happens in the early 19th century, gives a moral or religious impetus or motivation to reform society. The two biggest examples would be issues like temperance and slavery. The anti-slavery and abolition movements really get going in the 1820s as ministers, moral reformers, activists develop this idea of slavery being a moral wrong, not just in economic terms, economically insufficient for a free market capitalist economy, but immoral. And so the Second Great Awakening is really going to drive kind of the religious motivation, the spiritual motivation, the moral motivation to reform society. There's two theological trends that are new for the 19th century, that are new to American history, American religious history. These ideas are restoration and millennialism. And we'll talk about those here in a minute. To compare and contrast, if you remember from your study of the First Great Awakening, while it's kind of a reformed Calvinism, it's still Calvinism. Lack of free will among established churches, no democratic impulse, meaning in the First Great Awakening, kind of the idea for some aspect of free will develops, but it's still up to God. It's still God that is controlling you or influencing you. And so there's no democratic impulse that you're expressing your religious freedom or your religious will through religion. It's a restrained emotionalism, while ministers like Jonathan Edwards talked about, yes, you should have some type of emotional, spiritual experience. We should be able to see the body of Christ in you through your emotional conversion. There's still a restrained emotionalism. And so in the Second Great Awakening, when we study the revival meetings and camp meetings of the Second Great Awakening, we see an unrestrained emotionalism. You're supposed to express your emotional, spiritual feelings in church immediately. Saying you're a sinner, singing, dancing, shaking, whatever the Holy Spirit moves you to do. In the Second Great Awakening, there is a strong democratic impulse. This idea that you're expressing your freedom of religion, you're expressing your freedom through religion. That's one of the ways you are showing or demonstrating that you're American and that you have this freedom of religion by, through your religious journey. We're going to see some new churches, new religious ideas, and we'll have that up here in a little bit. We're going to see some non-traditional religious ideas. And again, the theological idea that is big in the Second Great Awakening, the biggest rejection of the Calvinism of the 18th century is this idea of free will. Again, like I mentioned, there's two new theological terms or ideas They're not necessarily new, like restoration goes back, but they're new for the 19th century. They're big and significant in the 19th century. Number one, restoration movements and millennialism. We'll go over different churches of the 19th century, and so on this slide there's just some examples, and I'll have a slide on most of these. Jehovah's Witnesses are outside of our class period, but they do fit in with these ideas of restoration movements and millennialism. What is the restoration movement? A restorationist in the 19th century was somebody who had this idea, the belief or the idea that Christianity in the 19th century no longer taught what Christ taught way back in the first century AD, 1800 years ago. And so the restoration movement, these restoration movements in the 19th century argue that over the 1800 years since Christ lived and died and was resurrected, Christianity has changed. Human beings with human ideas, Greek philosophy, human man-made false ideas have crept into Christianity and have changed what it means to be Christian. And so these restoration movements are arguing that we need to reject all the human stuff, the man-made stuff, the Greek philosophy, and go back to what Christ actually taught. So you're restoring, you're restoring, and that's why it's called the restoration movement. You're restoring something, Christianity, back to its original state. So rebooting, I guess you could say. You're bringing it back to its original state. You've kind of already seen this idea, the Reformation in the 1600s with Martin Luther and John Calvin. They were in effect restorationists too. Men like Martin Luther and John Calvin, that was their argument for reforming and developing what will become Protestant theology. That the church in the Christian church, Catholic Church in the 1600s, was no longer teaching what Christ taught, 1600 years earlier. And so for Martin Luther and John Calvin, that's why they were reforming. They said, we're going back to what Christ taught in the first century. And so now, three centuries later, in the 19th century, you have 19th century Americans saying the same thing, that we're going to go back and teach what Christ taught originally, returning to Christ's teaching. And so we're going to reject Catholicism because for these restoration movements, the Catholic Church is the church that went astray from Christ's teachings. And then what makes restorations even more controversial from the 19th century is they're not just saying Catholics are gone astray, but traditional Protestants have gone astray. So you got men like Martin Luther and John Calvin even went astray. And so these restoration movements, they're pretty controversial for 19th century America because not only are they rejecting the Catholicism of Christianity, but they're saying even a lot of these traditional Protestant churches are wrong too, or incorrect in some way. And so we want to go back to what Christ taught 1800 years ago. The second idea we want to get is millennialism. Millennialism is an emphatic belief in the immediate return of Jesus Christ. And so the difference here is, Christ lived, died, resurrected, ascended into heaven, and what did he tell his apostles when he ascended to heaven? He said, I'll come back. And so it's a general Christian idea that Jesus Christ one day will return. Okay. And come back to earth. And so that's a general Christian belief. What makes millennialism different than just the casual, Christ is coming back someday, I don't know, but it's an emphatic belief in the immediate return. Christ is coming today, tomorrow. The Millerites, October 15th, 1844. It's an immediate. Why? why is your church existing? To help people prepare for Christ's second coming. We have to prepare a people for the second coming. And notice how that ties into free will, right? Because what's supposed to happen when Jesus comes again? The wicked will be destroyed. Well, if everyone has free will to accept or reject God, what could possibly happen? If everyone has free will to be wicked, and when Christ returns, he's going to destroy the wicked, you could conceivably have Christ coming back with no one here, if everyone's wicked, right? And so for these millennialist churches, you have to prepare a people for when Christ comes again. Okay. And by the way, just to offshoot it, do you see how Calvinism gets around that? What does Calvinism say? God made sure there will be people here, right? You get it? If God is choosing who's saved, then there will be people. There will be people here on earth when Christ comes again and destroys the wicked, because God will pick or elect. God will elect people to be saved, and they'll be here. So you see how Calvinism gets around that possibility. So for these millennial churches that are heavily free will, if everyone has a human choice to decide whether God or the devil, then potentially you could have, if everyone chooses to be wicked, Christ could come again, there's no one here. And so for these millennial churches, these millennialist churches, the purpose is to make sure. You get it? Either God makes sure there's people here when Christ comes again, or human beings have got to make sure that there's people here when Christ comes again. And so for these Second Great Awakening millennialist churches, that's kind of the motivation. Is if it's free will, then we have to, as human beings, we have to make sure we're here when Christ comes again. And you see some examples there. To close out, here is a quote about popular religion from Alexis de Tocqueville. I'll give you a chance to read that.